So back in 1980, 40 years ago already, the United Nations General Assembly signed the resolution that created the University for Peace. And today we have, in total, I think I'm right with this number, but it's about 10 master programs that we give to different students all around the world. And within this university, we have the Department of Environment and Development. This is the department where we all work. And we give 2 different master programs. One is called EDP, Environment, Development, and Peace. And the other one is called Responsible Management and Sustainable Economic Development. And both of these programs are just like these webinars. The aim of these programs is to stimulate awareness of the complexity of all these challenges we are facing and have been facing and will be facing as a global community. And we think that the current crisis kind of highlights how interconnected and interdependent we all are. So that is why our programs aim to promote critical thinking while looking for long-term solutions that hopefully represent the diversity of our world. So for those who just got in, remember, turn off your cameras and mute your microphones, please. So for today, Alonso Munoz is an assistant professor at the Department of Environment and Development, and he's also the coordinator of one of the master programs, the one called Responsible Management and Sustainable Economic Development. And his research interests are material sustainability and circular economy in all its different forms. And today, in today's webinar, Alonso will talk about the widely held belief or the widely held view that recycling is the way to achieve sustainability. And he will debate or analyze key questions to better understand our broken waste management system. So thank you again, Alonso, for doing this, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Jan, and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon or night, depending on where you guys are. So the webinar is about recycling, and if recycling is the way towards sustainability. And so the answer to that question is no. And thank you so much for coming. It's always tough doing a joke on the online format. It's actually quite a tricky question. And but before I go into it, let me show you what my plan is for the next half hour. We're going to start with some definitions. I'm going to just briefly mention on why definitions are so important in this field. I'm also going to present a little bit about the current state of the system, what is being done in the most developed countries. So we know there's a system, and then there's the system of the most developed countries. So what is it that they're doing? How can the system be improved? And I want to wrap it up with what can we as individuals, as consumers, as voters, as people do to improve the system. So the reason why this is a tricky question is because it has 2 words that no one really understands. The first one that I want to address is sustainability. So last week, Jan touched upon how sustainability means different things to different people. He talked about how weak and strong sustainability, but we can go much further. If we see sustainable development goals, for example, here, we can see how broad the term sustainability really is. Is recycling going to take us there? Well, it really depends, but definitely not what we understand today as sustainability. So the other question that I want to focus more on this webinar is about recycling. It's because even when sustainability is complicated, we can have a full webinar about it. But then recycling, I know that you guys think you know what it is, but it's not that simple either. If I were to ask you what it was, I'm sure we would get dozens of similar yet different responses. And the devil is in the details. So etymologically speaking, recycling, quite straightforward, means to start a new cycle, of course. We don't know what cycle though. And EPA, for example, the United States Environmental Protection Agency, defines recycling as the process of collecting and processing materials that would otherwise be thrown away as trash and turning them into new products. This is what fits most of what people would say about recycling. So it's an object that it's used until it can no longer be used anymore. And then it's processed somehow, and then it becomes a new object. However, this is quite broad, but this fits with what we understand with recycling when we think about a glass bottle, for example. We use the glass bottle until we can no longer use it anymore, or when it breaks. And when it breaks, we melt it and we mold it, and then we create a new bottle again, and then the cycle continues. And so that's the typical example we think of when we think of recycling. However, that example is actually the exception, because when we take a closer look, we see that everything is recyclable, right? If you ask, is this recyclable, which is actually quite a common question, the answer tends to be yes. And yet, when we walk in a supermarket, almost nothing is made from recycled materials. So what's going on? For example, is this plastic bench that was made from plastic waste, is that recycling or not? Or what about these Adidas tennis shoes that are made from used plastic bottles? Is that recycling? Is it the same as the bench? Or what about this Tetra Pak container that when recycled, it's glued into this board-like material to produce these low-quality boxes or desks or tables? Would you say that that's recycling? Or what about a plastic product, like for example, this deodorant, that it's made from recyclable plastic, but due to the different polymers used, it cannot be easily recyclable. The shiny labels are one kind of plastic, the protective cap is another one, the twisted gear can be yet another kind of plastic. Would you say that this product is recyclable because its materials are all recyclable individually, but would the product itself be recyclable? Or what happened with this enormous variety of packaging, for example, like this tough to open clamshells, made from different kinds of plastic, and therefore being the headache of the recycling industry, as it's super hard to tell them apart. You're not able to tell if this is PVC plastic or PET or polystyrene, for example. So how can you recycle them if you don't know what they are? As we're starting to see, recycling is no easy task. Not only it includes loads of different things, like different things that kind of fit what we understand as recycling, but it's technically challenging as well. It is no coincidence that about 90% of the plastics produced don't ever get recycled. And it's because of this that there's so much plastic pollution around the world, having terrible consequences throughout. For those of you who have volunteered in plastic cleanups, for example, like the 5-minute beach cleanup and river cleanup and city cleanups, etc., most probably you got to realize that regardless of how many cleanups were done, waste simply never runs out. And the irony of this is that this is quite a new problem, because just a few decades ago, waste was always biodegradable. Besides this plastic pollution that we do see, there's a lot more in the form of microplastics or submerged deep down in the ocean floors. That it's out there, that it's polluting, and yet we don't see it, and therefore we rarely consider it. And that's why, every 3 weeks we hear of another animal who starved to death with his stomach filled with plastic. I really think we can do better. Because the thing is that recycling has been in a crisis for several years due to different reasons. Part of it is the complexity that I have shown here. Recycling is not easy, as it said. And we're not achieving much by putting our waste into the recycling bins as responsible consumers, as most of what we put there doesn't end up actually being recycled into new products as the way we understand them. However, as recycling was already struggling, since 2018, when China banned the imports of plastics and mixed papers, among other materials, when they did it, it collapsed the recycling systems around the world, urging them to find a market for something that it's pretty much useless. Because of it, the cost of recycling skyrocketed, and it forced many local governments to consider canceling their programs altogether. You see, what happens is that ships coming from China left all their exports in the big Western markets, in European and the different parts of the United States. And instead of going back empty, they would rather just carry for the very cheap price, the recyclables coming from the blue bins, as the United States calls them. However, most of it would actually be just unsorted, dirty waste, maybe all made from plastic, but really not didn't have much of a purpose. So when China stopped taking all this trash, then no one would take it. And because recycling only happens when there's a business model that supports it. But most of the plastic doesn't have one. And there's no way of sorting and cleaning and processing in an economically feasible manner all that goes into these recycling bins. And therefore, it's becoming harder and harder to find places to send this trash. So given that no one is paying for it to get sorted and cleaned, it just becomes too expensive to do so. So it's cheaper to buy new plastics than to actually process the plastics that we already have. And when we think the plastic system was having a bad role, comes this pandemic and makes a downward trend even worse. Not only is municipal collection being halted in many places because of the virus, but also given that plastic is made from oil, when oil prices fall, new plastics get much cheaper to make, and therefore the incentive to, like we said, collect and sort and clean the recycled plastic, there's no incentive in doing so because it's cheaper to just get new plastic done. So the system is now, during this pandemic and because of it, at a much worse stage than it was before the pandemic. So if everything that I have just said is true, then what about the most developed countries doing to overcome this? And how is it that Sweden, for example, recycles so much of its trash? The answer, quite frankly, is straightforward. They incinerate it. Given that plastic is made from oil, it's a great source of fuel. And therefore, Sweden and other rich countries like Finland and Germany and Spain and Singapore are converting their trash into electricity, with all the positive and negative things that it has, of course. In Costa Rica, for example, there has been several tries to legalize the incineration of trash, and it has not come through. So this is what the current global plastic systems looks like. It's very linear, as you can see. 98% comes from virgin stock, which just means oil. And then from the millions of tons that enter the plastic system every year, and this is 2013, so I'm pretty sure it's even bigger now, even more now during the pandemic, because of all the use of single disposable plastics. From all of it, 86% does not try to get recycled. So 14% ends up in incineration or as energy recovery plants like the one I showed from Sweden. 40% gets landfill. So all the plastic that I've used in my life in Costa Rica, given that what we have is a landfill, it's probably buried somewhere. And 32%, so about a third of it, ends up in the environment. From what gets recycled, a percentage is lost in the inefficiencies of the process, of course, and then 8% gets cascaded, what really means that it's downcycled, as the bench I showed you, that when you get, that you do products that are of lower quality of the original product that you had. So instead of the bottles or the plastics that were collected, that bench cannot be processed any further. And it's just one step away from being discarded, either as incineration, landfill, or leakage. So that's 8%. And just 2% is used in what's the closed loop recycling, which is this loop. And what it means is that only 2% is actually being used like the example I gave with the glass bottle, which is that this plastic is processed and made into similar or higher quality products. Like, for example, the Adidas tennis shoes. And that's why they're such an interesting case, because those Adidas tennis shoes, when you're no longer using them, you can send them back and they can be reprocessed, given that they're just one kind of material, and then they can actually close the loop. However, this system, you don't have to be an expert to realize that if you'd had to describe it, it's quite obvious that the system is broken. Because the thing is that technical feasibility of a material to be recycled is not enough for a product to be recyclable. It needs a whole system for collection and sorting and reprocessing at scale, and doing all of that at a feasible price. Right now, we are far, far, far from it. That's why the question, is this recyclable, cannot really be answered just by looking at the product, but we have to look at the system where it's at. So something that might be recyclable in some country might not be recyclable in some other country. Because the thing is that business as usual is grossly inadequate. We need this kind of systemic shift, because recycling isn't the real solution. Actually, it was the plastic industry's push recycling that got us into this mess. By shifting the blame for plastic pollution onto the consumers, the industry manipulated us into thinking that the problem was ours to solve, when in reality, a lot of the plastics are used in the supply chain that we don't even reach, and therefore we don't even have a say in them. It was the plastic industries, North America's plastic industries, that came up with the symbols, for example. And what those symbols mean, it's just the kind of resin that it's used to create that plastic. It doesn't mean that it's recyclable, as we like to think. It just means that that resin is used for that plastic. And in order to recycle them, if they were to be recycled, they should be put together. Of course, the million-dollar question, and what brought us here, is what can we do about it? Or is there something to be done? There's, before I answer, there's one solution that's being worked out right now in many countries, and it's based in several theories, many of them. And one of those theories comes from a magnificent game-changing book published in 2002 titled Cradle to Cradle. And this organization comes from a couple of articles, an architect and a chemist that came up with a wonderful book that I encourage you to read if this is a topic that seems interesting. And the other organization is currently based in London, and it's the organization Ellen MacArthur, who's doing a great job on this topic. They have a lot of materials available in their website if you'd like to know further. For example, what happens with clothes, or the food systems, or how should cities look, or where should we get our energy from, etc. The solution I'm talking about, it's of course circular economy, which aims to gradually decouple economic activity from the consumption of finite resources. If we were able to do this, then the pollution and extraction wouldn't be a problem. Of course, Jan, again, talked about this in the previous webinar. He talked about how economic growth, if we aim to achieve some sustainability while keeping the economic growth, we have to find a way to decouple the two. And so circular economy is right now the most promising option we have in order to do so. And if the whole materials were used in a closed loop, then pollution and extraction from the raw materials wouldn't be a problem. Let me briefly show you how it works. The most important aspect, and actually one of its principles, it's that the circular economy is very keen at keeping two cycles completely apart. The biological cycles, which is the products that we consume, are materials that are returned to the biosphere in the form of compost, from which new materials can be created. This means that all organics should go back into the land, as nature has been doing for millions of years. The tree gets its nutrients from the soil, it produces the flower that produces the fruit, that when the fruit falls, it either rots and goes back to the soil, or it's eaten by some animal that eventually the feces will go down into the soil. The technical cycle is the other cycle that circular economy makes emphasis on, is where materials are not consumed during the use of the product and can be reprocessed to allow them to be used in a new product. Like, for example, the example of the glass bottle that I gave you, or the aluminum cans. We drink from the aluminum, and then the aluminum is used again to create either another aluminum can or some other aluminum material, aluminum product, I'm sorry. This might be quite simple, but do you remember the Tetra Pak that I showed earlier? The Tetra Pak, it's made from perfectly compostable cardboard, perfectly reusable aluminum, and somehow recyclable plastic. However, by mixing all of them, it becomes a perfect example of how we're mixing the cycles, and therefore, by doing so, we're avoiding the aluminum to be reused and the cardboard to be composed. And after it's been used, there's nothing, after it has been recycled, there's nothing to do with it, except discarding it or incinerating it. But the problem is that we don't only mix in the Tetra Paks, of course. Right now, about 2/3 of the total waste that is being sent to landfills is organic matter. You as an individual, the biggest impact that you can have regarding your material sustainability is composting your own organics. This is like recycling in the biological cycle. Composting your own organics will save space in the landfill and will save all the carbon emissions from burying it in the landfill. However, given that what we actually do is burying it mixed with plastic and non-organic materials, all of these nutrients are never going back into the ground. So we're taking a lot of nutrients out of the soil and not putting them back. And so what are we doing instead of this? We're trying to put fertilizers, trying to make up for them. But clearly, for those of you who have studied the topic, there's a lot of consequences in the way we're using fertilizers up to this point. The other very important principle of circular economy is called designing waste out. Every manufactured product that we use has been designed by someone. We tend to forget that. So far, however, that designing phase has not taken into account the environmental impact of the product. Plastic packaging, for example, has a very short time in use, but a very long environmental impact. And one reason why so much plastic packaging ends up in incinerators, landfills, or the ocean is that it's not designed to be recycled. And so it has no better destiny. This is the case, for example, of the deodorant. We would like to recycle it and all the parts are recyclable, but the designing phase never made it easier for it to get, for it to be detached. So in order to increase the plastic recycling, we need to completely overhaul the system. Better labels, better design, better materials, including inks and polymers that can be used over and over and over. So we need to take care of the quality as well. And for it, we need innovation. Actively looking to design waste out. Now, there are many products that are already starting to think about how to design waste out of the equation. And there are many examples, but let me show you just a couple that I think are very simple and it will help us understand. Have you ever thought of how many toothpaste tubes have you used in your lifetime? I often try to picture all the trash that I've generated in my life. And for example, just these tubes that are made with plastic and metal are never going to decompose and are never going to become nutrients again and are always going to be there. And they're all of them together buried right now in the main landfill of the country. What about just rethinking at the end? What we need is the toothpaste, not the tube. So what about just rethinking a little bit and having, for example, this is just one of many solutions. And these tablets are what you use to brush your teeth with. So once the jar is empty, you can refill it with more tablets, and you can do this infinite amount of times. And if the jar breaks, you can just melt it, remold it, and have another jar again, and the cycle really begins. Another example is, for example, this Häagen-Dazs stainless steel reusable package that can be used many, many times. And once you can no longer use it, then it can be reprocessed again instead of this disposable ice cream container. Of course, one could think all the energy that is being used and the extra weight of the package. And that's why it's not just a simple product solution. It's actually, it has to be a systemic change that allows this that extends the life of the product so much that you can actually outweigh the negative impacts of the extra weight or the extra energy that it needs to be processed. This is like the eternal straw debate. There's the disposable straws that are super cheap and light, but at the same time they're disposable and therefore very, they create a lot of pollution. There's the bamboo straws that are compostable, so they belong to the biological cycle. And there's the stainless steel straws that can be washed and used forever, but at the same time they require a lot of energy. But the reason why I bring this up is because I want to be clear that sometimes the innovation means that the best product to be used is one that we don't need. So we always have to think, what is it that we need and what we need it for? And that's a big part of circular economy. Again, it's not as much of the product itself, but the system and the paradigms that we use in order to choose that topic. I mean, that product. So what can we do? This is, of course, the million-dollar question. And my point here is, what I wanted to show in this brief webinar is that we cannot do this on our own. This is a systemic problem that can only be solved with a systemic change. We're not getting anywhere if we focus on small tweaks or small improvements. We need to go bigger. And the role that each of us have, I believe, is being aware that this is a situation that deserves attention. And that's why I have to disagree with my good friend Emma, whom I've never met, as I think it's not our job to figure out how to deal with unrecyclable products and materials, but it is our job to ask governments for systems that will do so that we don't have to become plastic experts just to properly sort off our waste that most likely won't even get recycled in the first place. So we have to remember that when we have a closed system, there's no such thing as putting things away, because it all stays here. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Awesome, Alonso, thank you.
Gracias.
So I wanted to ask if there are any burning questions that you have. I looked at some of the comments that you wrote during the conversation or during the webinar itself. If there's no real question, one question is about Costa Rica. What can we do in Costa Rica, which is kind of the same question that you asked on a global scale. What can be done?
I think that in Costa Rica, I think that one key thing that we have to focus on is on our organics. Right now, there's actually quite a percentage of our carbon footprint as a country comes from the organics being sent to landfills and all the carbon emissions that it produces. Mm-hmm. So when we think as individuals in Costa Rica, there's a lot of ground, there's a lot of green space. We don't live like in these big, huge cities where we don't have parks around. So the biggest thing that we could do is separating our organics. If you start doing that, two things are gonna happen. One is that your garbage becomes a lot cleaner and a lot smaller, so that you don't need as much garbage bags and etc. to put it out. And the other one is the greater impact that it's not personally, but it would be on the whole scale of all the benefits of composting your own materials. If you don't have a garden, or if you don't have a place to actually compost in them in your own place. Like, for example, I live in a small apartment. You can have one of those, there are a lot of composting there are these small structures that they have like tumblers, so that you're composting one side while the other one is filling, and then you exchange and so on. By doing so, you would have the greatest impact. What you use as a consumer, like the plastic and the products that you buy, I think it's very important as well. But your biggest impact would be in the organic cycle.
Right. So in a sense, then it's probably not enough to just what you're saying. What I understand is that you say we cannot only depend on the consumer to do the right thing, right? We do need to probably look at regulation, and then as people are talking in the chat already, like how do we make governments, how do we make states to adopt or create new policies that address these issues much more aggressively than just waiting for the end consumer to change their habits?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that when we expect, and that's usually when we talk about this, usually the go-to place is it's about education, and I think that's a little bit buying into the plastic industry about making it our problem. I mean, it's our problem in the sense that we're suffering from it, but it's not our problem in the sense that we're the ones that should solve it. I think that look at how hard it's been getting people to wash their hands in this pandemic. So if this needs so much energy and so much effort, just getting people to wash their hands, something that has been said for the last 200 years, how are we to get people to become experts in separating and sorting plastics and all the water that it's needed to clean them before recycling it and so on? So I think that education is definitely key, as in everything, but it's education. I think it should be for the awareness of the urgency of tackling this issue, not as much as if I become, like Emma said, if I become educated, then I will buy the best products and then the industry is going to change, because I don't think that's the way it works. I think the system is way too big, and there are many products that, like I said, never actually reach the consumer. So my consumer choices don't really have such a big impact in those particular areas. I think we as consumers, like for example, the fact that I'm a responsible consumer, it's always important. But I think it's important because of what it means and what it says. And if I have this in mind, that I would try to support the politicians and the regulations that look this way, not as much as the impact that I will be causing by not buying one coffee cup instead of the other, because those are the small tweaks that I think are not really going to get us as far as we need to go in order to solve such a huge crisis. Especially, let me just continue with it, especially with the fact that as the world keeps getting richer and we're buying more stuff, so the amount of waste that we produce, for example, it's about 100 kilos per person in developed countries. As developing countries get richer, their environmental footprint also increases. So this means that as the world advances and time passes by and the world gets richer, we use more stuff. So this is a huge wave that's coming, and it's going to have a huge impact. So just trying to rely on education to make such a systemic change, I think it's not really understanding the size, the magnitude of the actual problem.
Yeah, thanks, Alonso. I was just remembering how, in our microcosmos of UPEACE at the campus, in the past, the cafeteria would sell all kinds of plastic bottles of all different beverages. Mm-hmm. And then I don't remember in which year students started to complain about it and make pressure on the administration. And some of us were part of that too. And at some point, the decision was made that the cafeteria shouldn't sell plastic. I don't know if you were really involved in that or if you were around at that time, if you remember, but I think that's such a great example of how easily something like the production of plastic waste was, the problem was reduced so significantly on campus when we stopped selling plastic bottles, right? Yeah. So the Coca-Cola company still comes up there, they bring the glass bottles, The people who want to buy Coke still buy it, and it works, right? And we have reduced the amount of plastic that has to be brought back down from our campus to Ciudad Colón and other recycling centers so significantly. And that's, it's not just a simple solution.
I think something important of what you're saying is that at the end, the quality of life, if you want to call it that way, that the people received from drinking their drinks was left untouched. Like no one really suffered from changing from plastic to glass. Actually, for most people, it tastes better in glass. But then I think that's a good example of how it was not about, I mean, we have a group of concerned students out on campus, and yet the plastic was always selling. So it's not a matter of education. It's not a matter of awareness. It's much harder than just educate people, encourage them not to make the best decisions. However, when the regulation was put in place, the whole pollution ended, and no one was sacrificed by the fact of just changing or having a better bottle than the ones we used to have. So I think that's a really good example, exactly.
Okay, one important question that is coming up in the chat is, like, what is your view on the legislation in Costa Rica? So Costa Rica has passed this anti-single-use plastic law. Have you seen data already that shows the impact of that, or what is your opinion on that law, even if you don't have that data?
No, and actually, yeah. So I was in a way part of the creation of. I think it was a really well. It was a really well made project. It consulted on a lot of different organizations that work on the topic, and therefore I was connected to it. However, the creation of the whole project was one thing, and then when it got to Congress, it was completely sabotaged, and then what remained was almost like a shell of the original one. Coming up with these legislations is not easy. I do have to give it that to our Congress people. However, what they did was they kneeled to the pressure of the plastic companies, and instead of seeing all the benefits that could have happened, they yield to the threats of the killing jobs and so on. So what happened with that particular project is what eventually got accepted is really not much. It's actually not much at all. And it's not in place yet. It has a long lead time. So I think some things start being regulated like a year after it was accepted, and mainly about 3 years after it was accepted. So we still don't have any data, and I don't really think it's going to have any impact at all. I think Costa Rica sells itself quite well when we think about the green image that we have. But I think in this field, in the plastic and pollution, we're far, far from where we have to be. At the end, some straws were banned, and not even all cases. So all straws are banned with restrictions and so else and so on. So I think the regulation Costa Rica needs is still to be drafted and accepted. So we're not there yet.
All right. I'm just scrolling through the chat to see if I forgot anything. There was one question about the role of the corporations and the companies that manufacture or that use a lot of plastic. Should they be made responsible to handle or to manage their own waste?
Yeah, so this is called the extended producer's responsibility. Mm-hmm. And the extended producer responsibility, what it means is that you are responsible for your product throughout the whole life. Because right now, usually what happens is that when I buy a product, then the consumer becomes responsible for it. So I am responsible for making sure that this product is recycled or if it's not. But it's my responsibility. So the extended producer responsibility, the way it works is that it extends that the product is the company's responsibility throughout. That makes it, what happens when you get these kinds of regulations in place is that instead of making everything more expensive and getting companies out of business, what actually happens is that they start rethinking how can they redesign their products in order for making that process much easier. And again, one example could be, a very simple, straightforward example could be the bottles that you were talking about. So in UPEACE, if the bottle was plastic, then the cafeteria would give it to you and then you would just go and do whatever you want with it. But when they move to glass, then the glass bottle has to be sold. So when the cafeteria gives you the drink, then they recollect the bottle back and then it ends up in the company again. So that way, just by switching the materials, the company remains a hold of the glass bottle instead of the plastic one that was just lost. So I think that the businesses that produce a lot of plastic are responsible. So are, of course, the consumers. And definitely, I think that the most responsible one should be the government, that it's the one setting the baseline for businesses to operate. There's a lot of lobbying and there will be a lot of back and forth, but I think we can come up with regulations that make sense in order for, like I said before, not sacrificing well-being of any of the roles, of any of the parts involved.
Okay, I know we're very close to the end, but I wanted to, there's several questions about compost. Mm-hmm. Is there any project for large scale or community composting or organic processing in Costa Rica?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. That's a great question. And sadly, this is managed mainly on municipal levels. So I do know that there's one large scale project in the municipalities of San Jose in the eastern part of the city. So Curridabat and Montes de Oca and others, they have interesting projects and they have amazing people working there. So I don't know much about these projects, but the thing is that once you have the composting facility in place, there's a huge system that has to be in place from the collection, from the sorting, from the consumers. For example, I lived in a city that had, in Europe, that had separated organics collection. And every time I would look at the dumpster where they would collect the organics, it was always filled with organics inside plastic bags. So for example, that makes it really complicated for the organic facility to compost it, for example. So it's a long process. Again, it's a systemic change more than just having the actual place, the actual facility, which is already complicated, but having the whole system that would feed and benefit from it. Because the compost at the end, what you would get, it's very rich fertilizers, and a lot of cities that use it, they use it in the parks and things. So it's great, but it's a huge shift. More than just the facility itself, it's a much bigger shift, and I think that sadly it's not as close as we need it to be.
All right, awesome. I think it's now in my clock, it's 1:46. We decided to be consistent with our time management.
All right.
Really German or Swiss.
That's what I was going to say.
I know, that was the joke that was coming from you. So I thank you again, Alonso. I think that especially the Q&A again is so great that we had time for you to answer some questions that made it really amazing to get all this extra or more specific information from you. And yeah, to the rest of the people, thank you so much for joining us.